Top Pentagon officials have spoken out in defense of a US bombing raid on pro-government forces in Syria on Thursday. Moscow called the strike a violation of an agreement on de-escalation zones in the country.
We're still looking into the details, but according to several reports, dozens of civilians died because of that airstrike. Whatever the reason for the decision by top US military officials to carry out the attack, it's not legitimate, it breaks the law, and it's a severe violation of Syrian sovereignty.
I made a commitment that they wouldn't happen again if our forces weren't threatened, and everybody understands what the rules are. So that's what's going to prevent it in the future.
Alexei Yaroshevsky brings us more details from Washington.
Well, the Pentagon's reactions seem to be very measured. They're almost trying to say that nothing major happened, but the rhetoric coming from Moscow is rather angry. And considering all the breakthroughs and all the advances that the two countries have managed to make over the Syrian issue as of late, according to Moscow, this jeopardizes the whole process greatly. And here is another statement by Foreign Minister Lavrov.
All this happens amid growing calls from Washington and several other Western capitals to cut all contact with Bashar Assad. All this is taking us far from a solution for Syria and from the main task, which is to prevent terrorists from capturing Syria and other parts of the Middle East. What we see with Washington's position with regard to Syria is an indulgence of terrorists.
So you heard there that the main task, according to the Russian foreign minister, is fighting terrorism. But nonetheless, the special presidential envoy to the international coalition fighting ISIS from the American side, obviously, Brett McGurk, had this to say about the Assad government.
Syria, of course, is far more difficult than Iraq. We don't have a government to work with, and we will never work with the Assad regime.
Well, one thing, of course, is Assad, and there's absolutely no surprise that the U.S. government would say something like that about the government in Syria. But there are a lot of questions, obviously. Who will fight terrorism in Syria, and what about other parts of the country where the U.S. does not have its military presence? And most importantly, what about Raqqa, the de facto capital of the Islamic State in Syria, which the United States has been contemplating to attack and to seize over the last several months? So McGurk had this to say in regards to Raqqa.
Unanimously, nobody wants the Syrian regime to come back. Regime symbols, regime military forces. In terms of administrative services, teachers, hospitals, who pays those salaries, that is something where Syrians are going to have to work that out. We are not in the business of as I said, nation-building operations.
So Syrians have to work this out, but at the same time, they don't want to work with Assad's government, and there's no government in Syria, according to McGurk. So again, this is all a quagmire, but just a reminder that only a few weeks ago, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and President Trump held talks about deconfliction zones in Syria and solving the whole terrorism problem in the country, and they said the talks were positive. But again, we see that with the latest developments, this positivity may be fading away again.
We spoke to political analysts Chris Banbury and John White about US military involvement in Syria.
I, for the life of me, cannot see how this airstrike helps in the slightest any possibility of there being a negotiated peace deal, which is surely what is required as the only way we can solve this civil war. It doesn't help in the slightest, and Daesh must be laughing up their sleeves. But we know what the problem is here. It's not just Daesh. We have al-Nusra Front, who are supposedly the good guys, even though they're linked to al-Qaeda, backed by the Saudis, who are part of the opposition the Americans are arming and training. So, it keeps coming back to there is no coherent narrative coming out from Washington here.
Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty when it comes to Washington's agenda in Syria. Many of us suspected all along that regime change was its primary objective, and that's been proved by the recent statement by Mr. McGurk saying that the Americans have no intention of working with President Assad. They deny his legitimacy, and I have no doubt that the Americans would actually rather have ISIL or Nusra in Damascus than Bashar al-Assad. We only have to look at what they've done to Libya in 2011. Somewhere, sometime, a line must be drawn in the sand. And this is the results of the unipolar world that we've been living with since the demise of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. It has been a disaster, especially for people in the Middle East. They have suffered enough.